Hey, Pastor David here. I wanted to answer the question, what is sin? Sin is rejecting or ignoring God in the world he created, not being or doing what he requires in his law. We talked about how Adam and Eve, our first parents, they lived in a world God had provided, but they rejected God's governing authority in their life. They were trying to push away the one who had provided for them, keep him from ruling them. That's the heart of sin. Sin is rejecting or ignoring God in the world he's created, rebelling against him by living without reference to him, but also not being or doing what he requires in his law. And this always results in our death. It results in our death and the disintegration of creation. You could think about it this way. Sin is disregarding and disrespecting God in the world he made. 1 John 3:4 says this: everyone who sins breaks the law. In fact, sin is lawlessness. Sin is a disrespect and disregard to the point where at times we're crossing over the law that God has made. The Bible uses the word transgression as sin at times, that we cross the boundaries God has set. Another place in Romans chapter 5, it says this: to be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. Now this could give us, I think, taken in as one verse, we might misunderstand thinking that if there's not a written law code, that there is no accountability. But I think what's being described is where there's no accountability, there can be no rejection of accountability. Where there's no authority, there can be no rejection of authority. And what we find in the Scripture is that all people have rejected the authority of God over them as their creator. Israel did it, rejecting the written law that was passed to them through Moses. But all people have done it, even in the fact that they have rejected God's given conscience, that they know there are moral things that are right and wrong that they actually cross over as well. So the Bible tells us very clearly that all people are wrapped up under sin, even if they don't have a written law code they've received from God. I think that's why the Scripture calls us very clearly to do things like 1 Corinthians 10:31. It says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. You see, the Bible does not paint a picture of simply finding out the descriptions of the law, as in where I can't go and where I must go, and navigating only within those. The Bible presents sin as a pervasive thing in which we exist outside of submission to God or against submission to God. It's manifested or it's displayed in the fact that God's given these very clear boundaries that we cross or expectations that we ignore. And so sin is this disregarding and disrespecting God in the world he's made in very specific ways. But it's far deeper than that in the human condition, because there are millions of little places that are not touched specifically in the law that are symptoms of what we as lawbreakers enjoy, ruling ourselves, disregarding God's authority to rule us. Jesus said this: if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, in doing this you will keep the whole law. That if you create a posture in your heart where you put God above everything else, you submit to his authority, and then you work for the best interest of those around you always, you will never sin. This is completely out of reach for anyone who hasn't been transformed by God's Spirit. We'll talk about those things in the future, because the way we are born is under sin. We actively ignore God's law in the things that he's given us to do, and we transgress the things he's told us not to do. We've crossed over those boundaries. But we live in a state, an existence of mind, heart, and action that is disregarding and disrespecting God. I think it's unhelpful for us to think about the idea of sin in terms of only action. God calls us to respect his authority and submit to him in the world he created with our head and with our heart and with our hands. Or we could think about with the way we think and the way we feel and desire and the way we behave. There is no success into having a sinless life if we just don't do bad things. We actually need to be transformed by God to affect the sin that goes on between our ears and in our chest, so to speak, and in our hands. That we would be people who, instead of rejecting and ignoring God in the world he created, we submit to and reverence God in the world he created with how we think, with how we feel and desire, and with how we behave. But we'll talk about these things in the future. Right now, I want to answer that question. What is sin? Sin is disregarding and disrespecting God in the world he made. Sin is rejecting or ignoring God in the world he created, not being or doing what his law requires.
Praise the mountain fixed upon it, Mount of God's unchanging